Welcome to Season 3, Episode 7 of CSS Breakdown, Book by Book. In this chapter of Michael Kimmel's The Gendered Society, we step into the classroom, not just as a place of learning, but as a powerful space where gender norms are reinforced, challenged, and sometimes resisted.
That's exactly right. Today, we're really going to take a deep dive into how schools, from those very first days in kindergarten right up through college, act as this major force in shaping how we understand gender.
And ultimately, our place within that gendered society.
Precisely. And all our insights today are pulled directly from Michael Kimmel's work, specifically his chapter focusing on the gendered classroom.
And this feels so relevant, doesn't it? I mean, we all went through the school system. We all saw, boys and girls treated differently sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
And we definitely heard that old idea, Kimmel calls it the interplanetary theory, right? That boys and girls are just fundamentally different.
Like they're from different planets, yeah.
Yeah.
Especially around academics or behavior.
Exactly. Boys like science, girls like reading, boys are loud, girls are quiet. That whole narrative, it's everywhere.
It really is. And it's easy, isn't it, to look at the differences we see in a classroom and just assume they're natural, innate.
Sure.
But the big question this chapter pushes us to ask is, are these differences we see the actual cause of gender inequality? Or are they, in fact, the result, the product, maybe, of how our schools are set up and how they operate? There's a quote in the material from law professor Deborah Rowe that really captures it. She says, "What schools teach and tolerate reinforces inequalities that persist well beyond childhood."
That really hits home. So, okay, our mission today in this deep dive is to unpack exactly how schools do this. How do they make us, gendered individuals?
Here's the formal lessons, obviously, but also
the hidden stuff, right? The hidden curriculum, how kids interact, how teachers interact with kids.
Exactly. How does all of that send and reinforce this message that, women and men are fundamentally different, and often that men are somehow superior?
And what are the consequences? That's crucial, too. Not just for girls and women, but for boys and men as well.
It's a really complex system, and its roots go way back, deep into the history of education itself, especially in America.
Okay, let's dig into that history then, because it sounds like from the outset, education wasn't exactly designed for everyone.
Not even close. If you rewind to the 18th century here in America, formal education was, pretty much exclusively for upper-class boys and men.
Women were just left out.
Deliberately, and often, quite aggressively excluded from colleges and universities.
And the arguments against them weren't just, oh, it's not proper. They used pseudoscience, didn't they? Biological arguments.
That's exactly it. Opponents claimed women were biologically limited. You find these really wild assertions in the material about educated women getting, monstrous brains and puny bodies.
Monstrous brains and puny bodies. Seriously.
Seriously. Or even, this one's bizarre, flowing thought and constipated bowels.
Wow. Okay. That says more about their anxieties than anything else, I think.
Doesn't it just? And you had respected figures like Harvard professor Edward Clark making these claims. The material details how he argued that studying would make women physically sick.
How sick?
He described them as becoming pale, weak, neuralgic, dyspeptic, hysterical, and even claimed it messed with their reproductive systems, things like menorrhagic, dysmenorrheic conditions, and arrested development of the reproductive system.
So the fear was literally that education would stop them from having children.
That was a core part of the anxiety, yes. The idea that they were just too delicate, too fragile to handle the rigors of academic life.
That Victorian ideal of frail womanhood.
Definitely. But even when women started pushing back and demanding access, there was huge resistance to educating boys and girls together.
How?
Coeducation was seen as damaging.
Damaging? How?
Well, the thinking was, as one university paper put it back in the 1890s, that male and female minds were just radically different, so they needed separate tracks.
Separate education paths.
Right. The president of the University of Michigan, way back, actually worried coeducation would create defeminated women and demasculated men.
Defeminated women and demasculated men.
And a local newspaper echoed that, warning it would unwarn and the woman and unman the man. Basically strip them of their essential gender identity.
Just by learning in the same room.
That was the fear, yeah. And it also led to worries about emasculating the curriculum, meaning they'd have to water everything down, slow the pace, maybe drop the tough subjects just to accommodate the women.
And the psychologist G. Stanley Hall even warned about homosexuality.
Yes, he explicitly warned coeducation would harm girls by making them too boyish, harm boys by feminizing them, and ultimately dilute heterosexual attraction, potentially leading to homosexuality.
Which is ironic given later research.
Completely ironic.
Yeah.
Kinsey's studies, mentioned in the material, found a lot of male homosexual experience actually happened in those very single-sex settings like boarding schools that Hall thought would prevent it.
So, despite all this pushback, the biological arguments, the social fears women didn't just accept exclusion. People fought for women's education.
Absolutely. You had the founders of the early women's colleges, places like Vassar, Wellesley, Smith. They saw education as fundamentally liberating.
Like Henry Durant at Wellesley.
Exactly. The material quotes him viewing women's education as a revolt against the slavery of their lives, the broken health, the aimless lives, the subordinate position, the helpless dependence that society imposed on them.
That flips the script, doesn't it? Dependency isn't the reason to deny education, it's the result of denying it.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that lines up with what a British physician, Henry Maudsley, argued back in 1874. He said the perceived weakness and dependency of women weren't inherent traits, but consequences of gender inequality.
He blamed their limited lives.
Yes. He described American girls being denied sports, constrained by clothing, leading to this languid young ladyhood, a kind of martyrdom to propriety and fashion that physically wrecked them. He actually argued that hard study was a tonic against the idleness and melancholy, and that women graduates were perfectly healthy wives and mothers.
Okay, so you have these powerful arguments for women's education, but actually getting into existing institutions was still a battle.
A huge battle. The example from the University of Rochester in 1900 is pretty striking. The university basically said, okay, we'll let women in if you raise the money for new facilities.
They put the burden on the women themselves.
They did. And women, including Susan B. Anthony, rallied, worked incredibly hard, raised the money, met the challenge.
And then, were they welcomed with open arms?
Hardly. The material describes the male students reacting with hostility, stamping their feet, physically blocking classroom doors, jeering at the women.
Wow, and the administration.
Their response was to segregate the women. They created separate women's college, which was predictably far from equal to the men's college.
That's unbelievable. They met the condition, raised the funds, and were still segregated and treated with hostility.
It really shows how these institutions, even spaces supposedly dedicated to intellect, were actively used to enforce gender difference and social hierarchy.
So the classroom wasn't just about books. It was about keeping people in their gendered boxes.
You could definitely argue that, based on this history.
Yeah.
And this whole process of gendering, this reinforcement of norms, it doesn't wait for college. It starts the minute kids walk into school.
Right. Nursery school, kindergarten, you can almost see it in the layout of the room.
Think about it. You often have the block corner with trucks and tools, right? And then maybe the doll corner, the play kitchen area.
The homemaking zone.
Exactly. And even if the teacher says, oh, it's all open, play wherever you want, those areas tend to become gendered very quickly. Boys often head for the blocks, girls for the dolls. And those invisible lines get enforced, sometimes by the kids themselves, sometimes more subtly by the adults.
And it spills outside, too, right? Onto the playground. Different games, different rules, different spaces claimed by boys versus girls.
Totally. It's all deeply gendered from a very, very young age. The material shares this really powerful anecdote from a nursery school teacher that just lays it all bare.
Ah, the story of Brad.
Yes, Brad. The teacher described how the school had different zones, quiet inside, medium activity at the door, and the far yard for big, gross moto play.
Okay.
And the typical pattern. Girls would come in calmly, hang up their coats neatly, maybe look at books or play quietly indoors. The boys, they'd burst in, chuck their coats somewhere, and immediately race outside to that far yard, yelling, wrestling, being loud.
Standard stuff, maybe. But Brad didn't fit that mold.
Not at all. He was described as quiet, thoughtful, bright, and every single day he'd walk right past the chaos, ignore the boys rushing outside, and go straight to the easels to paint. And apparently he was quite good at it, very focused.
And his parents' reaction is, well, it's something.
It really is. The teacher mentioned the parents were actually thrilled to have a male teacher in the classroom. But when they saw Brad painting, day after day, they looked. The word used is terrified.
Terrified of painting.
They pleaded with the teacher, begged him, almost demanded that he get Brad out to the far yard with the other boys.
Why? What was the underlying fear there?
The teacher figured it out pretty quickly. The material says the specter of homosexuality hovered in the air.
Ah.
Brad's quietness, his preference for art over rough play, his just nonconformity to that specific loud, far yard type of masculinity. His parents weren't seeing personality quirks. They were seeing or fearing potential signs about his future sexual orientation.
So it was all about ensuring they produced a masculine and heterosexual son, as the material puts it.
That seems to be the core anxiety. And even though the teacher tried to reassure them, Brad's happy, he's good at painting, they kept pushing. Get him to play with the trucks. Get him outside.
Wow. That anecdote just perfectly illustrates how deep these norms run, how early the pressure starts, and the anxieties adults project onto kids who don't fit neatly into those boxes.
It really shows schools aren't just passive places. They're active sites where these societal pressures get played out. And it's not just the kids or the parents, teachers themselves play a big role, often without realizing it.
Yeah, the material brings up the Sadker's research, right, about girls getting less attention.
That's a key finding discussed. Their work, Failing at Fairness, consistently showed that from elementary school all the way through college, female students tend to receive less active instruction from teachers, less quantity and quality of teacher time and attention.
And teachers just perceive boys and girls differently, have different expectations.
It seems so. The material mentions teachers, often seeing boys as, active, maybe prone to anger, quarrelsome, exhibitionistic even. Girls, more often seen as affectionate, obedient, responsive, tenacious.
And how teachers react or don't react to things like boys putting girls down, that sends a message too.
A huge message. The material points out that when teachers ignore those common put-downs, they implicitly signal to the boys that their behavior is acceptable, maybe even that their sense of superiority is justified.
And this carries over into academics.
Absolutely. Teachers often operate on assumptions. Girls love reading, but hate math and science. Boys are the opposite, and this shapes how they interact.
How so?
Well, the research indicates teachers are more likely to call on boys, spend more time answering boys' questions, pose more challenging questions to boys, and wait longer for boys to formulate an answer. They're constantly urging boys, come on, you can do it, try harder.
Pushing them more.
Pushing them more actively, yes. There's even a study mentioned showing boys dominate participation in college classrooms, regardless of whether the teacher is male or female. Although a female teacher did seem to increase girls' participation a bit.
So overall, the AAUW reports summarized in the material confirm this pattern. Males get more teacher attention.
Consistently, yes. And when teachers are asked why, the justifications often circle back to perceived needs. Oh, the boys need more, or they have trouble with reading and math, or they just can't sit still.
Which kind of sounds like they're trying to manage behaviors that might themselves be linked to gender expectations, but the result is still differential treatment.
It can definitely become a self-reinforcing cycle. And beyond these interactions, what kids are actually learning from the curriculum, the books, the media they consume, that's another huge source of gender stereotyping.
What they see matters. What's in the books, what's on the screen.
Immensely. The content itself is packed with messages. Research on illustrations, for example, found boys' faces show up more often, even when they're shown making mistakes. It subtly suggests they're the central characters, the ones allowed to be flawed and still important.
And historically, textbooks and children's literature were just full of these biases.
Well, absolutely. For decades, studies consistently have found really traditional depictions of sex differences and strong pro-male biases. Females were often just missing or barely there.
Underrepresented in pictures, titles as main characters.
Exactly. And when they were included, their roles were often really limited. They were shown loving, watching, helping, while the males were out having adventures, solving problems.
And women's work.
Rarely depicted outside the home. Motherhood was often presented as the only job, a full-time, lifetime occupation. The visuals reinforce it too. The son in trousers looking active, the daughter in a skirt looking passive. Even biographies of famous women like Marie Curie often frame them primarily as helpers to the men in their lives.
The studies on the Caldecott Award books really highlighted this, didn't they?
They did. The early research from the late 60s, early 70s found pervasive gender bias in these supposedly top-quality children's books. Later updates showed some improvement, like females were more visible, but their portrayal often remained skewed towards being passive or submissive, while males were active and independent.
And a quote from that Weitzman study really sticks out.
Yeah, about the lack of female role models with career goals, and also the limited portrayal of tender emotions in boys. It cuts both ways.
A big government study in 1975 looked at a wider range of textbooks, too.
And found similar imbalances, like a 5-to-2 ratio of boy-centered stories versus girl-centered stories, 3 times as many adult male characters as female, 6 times as many biographies of men, 4 times as many male fairy tales.
Wow. It led one scholar to remark it was like presenting a nation with only founding fathers.
A pretty apt summary.
Have things gotten any better more recently in kids' books?
The material suggests some positive shifts. Yes, girls and women are more likely now to be main characters. They're depicted as less passive, sometimes shown with more ambition or career goals.
But there's a but.
There's a but. Traditional stereotypes, especially around girls being more interested in domestic life, still seem to linger. And crucially, there's this asymmetry.
The point about men. If women are shown leaving the home more, are men shown coming into the home more?
Exactly. And the material argues, no, not really. There hasn't been a comparable shift towards depicting men embracing nurturing roles or domestic responsibilities in a widespread way.
And this media reinforcement goes way beyond books, obviously. TV, movies, music videos.
Huge influences.
Yeah.
Mass media often just echoes and amplifies the stereotypes kids encounter at school or in books. Children's TV, for instance, often mirrors that playground dynamic. Boys are central, girls are in the background. Helpful, maybe less important.
Even Sesame Street is mentioned as having historically had more male than female characters.
Yeah, that's cited as an example. And commercials. The material presents them as being particularly explicit about linking gender roles to products.
The classic toy divide.
Right. Boys get cars, trucks, action figures. Girls get dolls, play kitchens, beauty stuff. And notice who often does the voiceover, the authoritative voice selling the product. Often male.
So the underlying message is,
buy this, consume this, and it will help you be the right kind of man or woman. That's the powerful lesson the material points out.
okay, but primetime TV, especially since the 70s, has definitely shown some evolution, right? Particularly for women.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
There's been a clear shift away from characters like, Lucy Ricardo or Samantha Stevens or Alice Cramden. Women often defined by their homes and needing male help towards more assertive, independent characters. Think Mary Richards, Rhoda, Cagney and Lacey, Roseanne, Murphy Brown.
Women in traditionally male jobs, too.
Doctors, lawyers, cops. It became much more common to see women in those roles on screen.
But again, that asymmetry question, did men's roles evolve in parallel?
The material argues largely no. Men are still overwhelmingly shown as ambitious, focused on work, out in the public sphere. Those classic devoted TV dads like Jim Anderson or Ward Cleaver. Less common now.
And when men are shown at home?
They're often the butt of the joke,
Yep.
right? Like Ralph Cramden, Ozzie Nelson, Homer Simpson, Tim Allen's character on Home Improvement, Dan Connor on Roseanne. They're often portrayed as incompetent domestically. There are exceptions, of course, like Bill Cosby's character was presented differently. But often, if men are shown being nurturing, it's in the public sphere, like George Clooney's character Mark Green on ER.
So TV kind of reflects this societal tension. Women can leave the home, though they often face struggles balancing everything, but men stepping into the domestic sphere often risks their perceived masculinity.
It reinforces that idea that gender difference and gender inequality are these mutually supporting ideologies. And the material also briefly touches on media and violence.
Yeah, the National Television Violence Study findings sounded pretty grim.
Very concerning. It found violence was just everywhere on TV in 61% of shows studied. And the patterns were clear. Often committed by white males, perpetrators often go unpunished, show little remorse, their actions are frequently justified in the story, and almost half the time, it's presented humorously.
And the real consequences are ignored.
The serious, painful, long-term impacts of violence,
Yeah.
largely invisible. And a later study, up to 2005, actually found violence per hour in prime time had increased significantly by 75%, an escalation.
Okay, so you have all these layers building up. The history, the early socialization, teacher interactions, the messages from books and media.
And the cumulative effect, according to the material, is this significant divergence between boys and girls, which becomes really stark by adolescence.
This is where we see that pattern often talked about girls' self-esteem taking a nosedive.
Exactly. In elementary school, girls often have higher self-esteem, higher achievement levels than boys. But then junior high hits, and boom, girls' self-esteem plummets.
There was even a stat about IQ scores dropping.
Yes. Studies cited showed girls' scores dropping significantly, around 13 points on average during adolescence, compared to a much smaller drop, about 3 points, for boys.
And this is the age where appearance starts to become paramount, right? They learn their value is tied to how they look, maybe more than what they can do.
The material gives some really heartbreaking examples of this. Ashley Ryder, this incredibly bright young woman who won a major science award for math modeling.
And people congratulated her on.
Her contact lenses and her looks. The day after winning, no one mentioned the math. Another college woman recalled always being praised for her appearance, and then people being shocked, like, wow, you have a 4.0 and you're a national merit finalist,
Right.
as if the two were incompatible.
It's like they're pressured to downplay their smarts to be liked, to be seen as feminine.
As Carolyn Heilbrunn put it, quoted in the text, they sacrifice truth on the altar of niceness. And this isn't trivial. It has real, sometimes dangerous consequences.
Like eating disorders.
The material links this pressure directly to rising rates of eating disorders, which are also starting younger and younger. Teenage pregnancy is also mentioned, with the observation that the mothers almost always drop out of school, while the fathers typically don't face the same consequence.
And on top of these internal pressures, the actual school environment can become hostile. Sexual harassment is a huge issue.
Presented as a major problem, yes. And maybe even more complex than workplace harassment because it's happening among peers in that intense adolescent social environment. Surveys back in the 80s were already showing it was widespread for girls.
And lawsuits started bringing it out of the shadows.
Yeah, the material highlights key cases. Katie Lyle, whose school wouldn't remove horrible graffiti about her. Tanya Brody, harassed by boys making obscene gestures. The school did nothing. Christine Franklin, whose case went to the Supreme Court establishing harassment as Title IX discrimination. And the Davis case, where parents sued because officials ignored constant peer harassment against their daughter.
An AAUW study found it was incredibly common.
Shockingly common. Nearly 4 out of 5 girls, 78%, and over 2/3 of boys, 68%, reported experiencing harassment. And the material stresses the perpetrators were almost always other boys.
And the examples given by Bernice Sandler are just brutal.
They really are. Things like skirt flip-up day, pulling down boys' pants too, mirrors on shoes to look up skirts, holding up scorecards rating girls, grab a piece of ass week, circulating lists of sluttiest girls. It paints a picture of a really toxic peer environment in some places.
It's truly horrifying. It makes you realize the level of hostility some kids face just trying to go to school.
And the material links this kind of pervasive harassment and gender policing to even more extreme behaviors, citing the Spur Posse case.
Right, the group of high school boys in California who were competing for sexual conquests.
Yes, affluent suburban kids who literally kept score, using athletes' names as codes for different numbers of sexual partners. They treated young women entirely as objects, as the material puts it, vehicles for homosocial competition, basically, ways to gain status with other guys.
And the parental reaction, or at least the father's reaction, was disturbing too.
That's a key point. While mothers were reportedly horrified, some fathers were quoted expressing pride, saying things like, "That's my boy," or defending it as normal behavior for a red-blooded American boy. It really raises questions about where these boys were getting these messages.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the challenges girls face, but inevitably the conversation turns to, well, what about the boys?
It does. And the material is very clear. Just because girls are facing systematic pressures doesn't mean boys are sailing through unscathed. They encounter significant problems within the school system, too.
The statistics for boys, especially early on, are quite alarming.
They really are. Boys are 4 times more likely to be sent to psychologists in elementary school, much more likely to be diagnosed with things like dyslexia or ADD. Their report cards tend to be poor. They're more likely to repeat grades.
And they dominate special education categories.
Vastly. 9 times more likely to be diagnosed as hyperactive. 58% of students labeled mentally retarded, 71% of learning disabled, 80% of emotionally disturbed. And suspensions. Nearly 3/4 go to boys.
And this continues into adolescence.
They become more likely to drop out, flunk out, act out. Their self-esteem also drops during adolescence, though maybe not as precipitously as girls. And interestingly, data cited from 2001 suggests girls were actually more likely to be involved in extracurricular activities overall, except for athletics.
So this collection of data has fueled this counter-narrative, the war against boys.
Exactly. The material explains how some interpret these stats as proof that boys are now the new victims of gender discrimination in schools.
The argument being that schools are basically set up for girls.
Yeah, that schools are run by women for girls and implicitly demand that boys behave like a girl. Christina Hoff Sommers is quoted calling this the pathologizing of boyhood.
And others argue schools just don't meet boys' needs.
Like Michael Thompson, quoted suggesting schools need to acknowledge boys' physical nature, their restlessness, impulsivity. The core of this backlash argument is that all the focus on girls, self-esteem, math, science, harassment has meant boys' issues have been ignored. Hence that constant question, what about the boys?
But the source material pushes back on this idea of a feminizing environment.
It does. It makes the point that schools and workplaces are part of the public sphere, which has historically been male-dominated. When women enter these spaces, they are often the ones expected to adapt, adopting more masculine dress or behavior to be taken seriously.
Like the Ralph Lauren ad example.
Right, showing girls dressed in traditionally masculine clothes like Oxford shirts and ties. The material uses this to ask, who is really being masculinized or feminized here? It challenges the premise that the school itself has become inherently feminine.
And the idea that boys are just biologically more aggressive is also questioned.
The material suggests it's more nuanced. Maybe it's a social byproduct, an exaggeration of natural energy levels, performed largely for peer approval. The focus shifts from innate aggression to the intense pressure on boys to constantly posture and parade their masculinity before the evaluative eyes of other boys.
Which leads into this idea of the mask of masculinity.
Yes, drawing a parallel to Carol Gilligan's work on girls losing their voices. The argument presented is that as girls might silence parts of themselves, boys develop a voice too. But it's often an inauthentic voice of bravado.
A performance.
A performance involving constant posturing, taking stupid risks, sometimes gratuitous violence. Psychologist William Pollack is quoted describing this mask, a voice disconnected from real feelings. It reminds me of that Yeats quote mentioned, "Ruffle in a manly pose for a timid heart."
And this pressure to perform masculinity has real consequences for academics, surprisingly.
It creates this interesting dynamic. Girls, perhaps undervaluing their abilities after losing their voice, might shy away from traditionally masculine fields like math or science. So only the most confident, maybe the highest achieving women, trespass into those areas.
Fewer women, but potentially higher average grades among those who do enter.
That's the suggestion. Meanwhile, boys, wearing that false voice of bravado, might overestimate their abilities and stick with programs, especially in math and science, even if they're less qualified, perhaps due to societal or family pressure.
And the Shelley-Carell study provides evidence for this self-perception gap.
It's fascinating. 8th grade boys and girls with identical math grades and scores were asked how good they were at math. The boys were significantly more likely to say things like, "I've always done well in math," or "Mathematics is one of my best subjects." Even though their actual performance was the same as the girls, they believed they were better.
And this belief has implications beyond just feeling good about yourself.
It affects who stays in which subjects. The material suggests this might partly explain why girls' average math and science scores have been catching up. Not just because girls are improving relative to their ability, but because the average male score might be pulled down by less qualified boys persisting in those fields, while only the top-tier girls enter, pulling the female average up.
And you see a mirror image in humanities and social sciences.
Exactly. Girls often outperform boys in subjects like English or foreign languages, but the material argues this isn't reverse discrimination either. It links it back to those norms of masculinity.
Boys seeing English as feminine.
Right. Carell's study found those same boys who overrated their math skills actually rated themselves worse than the girls did in English and languages. And Wayne Martino's study in Australia had boys saying things like, "Reading is lame," or "Guys who like English are faggots."
They disliked it because it wasn't clear-cut.
They complained it lacked set rules, that you had to write about how you feel, which they saw as subjective, not real work. Girls, on the other hand, often appreciated the freedom in English, the space to express their own views.
So the argument isn't that school feminizes boys, but that traditional masculinity itself discourages boys from engaging fully in areas perceived as girls' work.
That's the core point presented, like the teacher quoted who observed boys not wanting to look too smart or like they're pleasing the teacher, or Andrew Hacker's comment that girls are simply better at being good students, not because of biology, but because being seen as a good student conflicts with traditional ideas of being a man.
It echoes James Coleman's old study about the hidden curriculum, where jocks were valued over scholars by peers.
Exactly. And this whole war against boys anxiety. The material draws a direct line back to similar panics at the turn of the 20th century.
About coeducation and female teachers ruining boys.
Yes. Fears about boys becoming wimpy pantywaists, their boyhood diluted in a feminizing sea.
And the response back then was,
To deliberately create more masculine spaces and activities outside the classroom. The rise of college sports, Teddy Roosevelt's strenuous life ideal, the founding of the Boy Scouts, all explicitly aimed at rescuing boyhood, making boys hardy again. There's even a quote from 1927 complaining about literature becoming emasculated. These anxieties have a long history.
Okay, let's shift focus to higher education, college. There have been big changes in who's enrolling, and that's caused its own stir.
A major shift, absolutely. Women started outnumbering men in college enrollment back in 1982, and that trend has continued. Projections cited from 2007 suggested women would earn nearly 60% of bachelor's degrees.
And this got spun into a kind of crisis narrative for men, like
Yeah.
that projection of an all-females graduation line.
Yes, sociologist Joel Best, whose work is discussed, calls this a manufactured crisis. He makes a crucial point. The actual number of men enrolling in college didn't drop. It actually increased substantially between 1970 and 2000, faster than the male population grew in that age group.
So it's not that men stopped going to college.
Not at all. It's that women's enrollment grew much, much faster, like 143% faster in that same period. Women caught up and surpassed men in the rate of enrollment, not because men were dropping out en masse.
That's a really important clarification.
It is. And the material points out that the people sounding the alarm about this crisis for boys often ignore ongoing disparities that don't fit the narrative. Like the fact that some elite universities still enroll slightly more men, or the fact that nobody talks about a crisis when women overwhelmingly dominate fields like nursing or education, which also happen to be lower paid.
Sarah Mead is quoted making that point. The very idea that girls could be ahead is so shocking, it immediately becomes a crisis for boys.
And she adds another layer. Even with similar degrees, male graduates still tend to earn more right out of college.
Mm-hmm.
Which makes you ask, as she does, is it just grades that matter, or is there something else the boys may be doing that leads to better pay?
This connects to Cynthia Fuchs-Epstein's idea of deceptive distinction, doesn't it?
Perfectly. The material uses her concept to argue that what looks like a simple gender gap might actually be masking deeper issues of class or race. That apparent shortage of male college students, when you break down the numbers.
It's primarily a shortage of non-white males.
Exactly. The data presented shows the gender gap for white students is pretty small, but it's significant for low-income black students, where males make up only 36% of enrollment, and low-income Hispanic students at 39% male. Class and race intersect powerfully with gender here.
Okay, so we've talked about inequalities affecting both girls and boys. Is there evidence that reforms aimed at helping girls actually end up benefiting boys too?
The material strongly argues yes. Educational reforms often inspired by feminist critiques, things like more individualized instruction, recognizing different learning styles, team-building exercises. These approaches can create a better learning environment for all students, not just girls.
And the gender mix of the campus itself might matter.
Linda Sachs's study, cited, found that on college campuses where women were the majority, both men and women reported getting higher grades. Interestingly, men on those campuses also showed a greater commitment to racial understanding and held more liberal social views.
So environments sometimes labeled feminized might actually have positive outcomes for men too.
That's what the data suggests. And more broadly, any effort to make schools safer challenging stereotypes, reducing bullying and violence obviously benefits everyone. The material contrasts the minor discipline issues of 1940 with the serious problems like drugs and violence common by 1990, arguing that the old boys will be boys. Attitude hinders creating safe learning environments for everybody.
It really pushes back hard against that zero-sum battle of the sexes idea in education.
Completely. The argument is that gender equality in schools isn't about taking from one group to give to another. It lifts everyone. That old Amherst College quote nails it. Advancing women benefits men just as much.
If equality is beneficial, why do these pressures and inequalities persist so strongly? What are the mechanisms keeping this gendered system in place?
This brings us to the concept of the gender police, as the material terms it. It's about how success in school, even just belonging, gets tied up with conforming to rigid gender roles.
So girls might see doing well academically as fine or even good, but for boys.
For boys, the message often becomes that being too connected to school, too academically successful, is somehow feminine, not what a real boy does.
And the consequences for not conforming are severe.
Immense. You risk losing respect, losing friends, becoming a target for bullies, and the enforcers. It's primarily peers. Peer culture establishes the rules and enforces them constantly, relentlessly, and mercilessly.
And that phrase, "that's so gay," is presented as a key tool of this enforcement.
Yeah, the material argues it's often less about actual homophobia, though it can be, and more about policing gender boundaries, especially for boys. It's used to shut down any behavior seen as deviating from narrow masculine norms.
Like showing weakness or sensitivity.
Exactly. The quote from Dave explains how showing compassion could get you labeled gay. because it's seen as weak in a survival of the fittest peer culture. Eminem is quoted explaining faggot as the ultimate insult to strip a man of his manhood, calling him a sissy. It's about gender policing.
Using homophobia as a weapon to enforce masculinity.
High schools become these intense testing grounds where your gender performance is constantly being evaluated by your peers, often against unclear and shifting standards. And bullying is the enforcement mechanism. It's described as a national problem because it's so pervasive and can range from insults to actual assault.
The statistics on bullying are just staggering.
Millions affected every year. Studies showing huge percentages, observing it, experiencing it, participating in it, sexual harassment by peers, dating violence. It paints a grim picture of the social environment many kids navigate.
And this creates real fear.
Definitely. Many kids are genuinely afraid of certain parts of school locker rooms, hallways, bathrooms, lunchrooms. They worry about violence, about weapons. Parents worry too.
Hazing is another disturbing aspect, especially in those male-dominated spaces like sports teams.
Called out is particularly terrifying. The stats on hazing prevalence in high school groups are high, involving humiliating and sometimes illegal acts. It happens in marching bands, even church groups, and substance abuse is often linked to it.
What happens to the kids who are targeted by all this?
The material says most find ways to cope, they're resilient, they try to fit in, but many carry scars, psychological or physical. Some withdraw, become depressed, alienated, some self-medicate, and a very small, tragic few explode.
Leading to school shootings.
Yes, the phrase uses doing a Columbine. And the material identifies a really striking pattern among the perpetrators of 29 random school shootings between 1992 and 2006.
All boys.
Every single one. All but one in rural or suburban schools, not inner cities.
Yeah.
All but two were white.
And the argument is that we often miss the significance of that pattern, white, male, suburban, rural, by just calling it youth violence.
Exactly. The material suggests if the shooters fit a different profile, say poor black girls from the inner city, we'd immediately be talking about race, class, and gender. Maybe even blaming feminism.
Yeah.
But because of who they are, those factors often get ignored.
And the common thread in their stories is?
Almost universally, according to the material, they were relentlessly bullied, harassed, and gay-baited. Not because they were actually gay, there's no evidence presented for that, but because they were different from the dominant masculine norm.
How were they different?
Often described as shy, bookish, maybe honor students, artistic, not athletic, geeky, weird, sometimes overweight or underweight, wore glasses just not fitting the mold of the popular athletic boy.
The specific examples are chilling. Luke Woodham.
Overweight, smart, studied Latin, teased constantly as gay, fag.
Yeah.
Bullied, never fought back physically, killed his mother, then shot students, leaving notes about how the world has wronged me, how murder is gutsy, because people like me are mistreated.
Michael Kimmel.
Shy, small, glasses in the band. Felt picked on, alienated. Had his lunch stolen, pants pulled down in class. Devastated by being called faggot. Got guns hoping the cool guys would accept him. When they didn't, he shot into a prayer group. Later said, "People respect me now."
And Columbine. Harris and Klebold seemed okay on the surface, but faced constant torment.
From the jock culture, yes. Other students quoted calling them rejects, homos, saying everyone would make fun of them. They were physically harassed, rumored to be lovers. The material suggests this relentless torment fueled their deadly plan.
So while these horrific events are rare, the point is that the underlying fear of being targeted for not conforming to gender norms is pervasive.
Gender conformity, especially for boys, is extracted through fear. Fear of social exclusion, psychological torment, and sometimes physical violence.
Now shifting focus again, schools aren't just for students, they're workplaces. And gender shapes that environment too.
Absolutely. Historically, teaching was actually seen as a respectable job for men, think Ichabod Crane. But that changed dramatically in the 19th century with the whole separate spheres ideology.
Pushing women out of other work and into teaching.
Exactly. Elementary education became seen as suitable for women, aligning with their perceived maternal nature, especially as schools expanded and started grouping kids by age.
And there was an economic incentive for administrators.
A huge one. They realized they could pay women much, much less than men for the same teaching jobs. So teaching, especially at the elementary level, became feminized.
Which lowered its status and pay.
Right. Prestige dropped, salaries dropped, which further discouraged men, cementing it as women's work. But crucially, the administrative jobs principals, superintendents, remained overwhelmingly male.
So the school structure mirrored other gendered institutions, women in the lower ranks, men at the top.
Pretty much. And there were even debates back then about the invasion of women teachers, fears about feminized manhood.
What does the gender breakdown look like today?
Based on data around 2000 cited in the material, women still dominate the early grades. 98% of preschool kindergarten teachers, 87% special ed, 67% other elementary. Men are more represented later. They make up about 41% of secondary teachers and 54% of post-secondary faculty. The proportion of women decreases as you go up the educational ladder.
And salaries still reflect this gender composition.
Generally, yes. Fields with more women tend to pay less. Within education, women consistently earn less than men in similar roles. An example from 1980 showed female pre-kindergarten teachers earning much less than male ones. These gaps often widen at higher levels, partly due to experience-based raises and women being more likely to take time off for a family.
But what about in higher education? More women faculty now, but still not equal.
The number of women faculty increased significantly, up to about a third by the late 80s, but equity is still elusive. Women are concentrated in less prestigious institutions, fewer than 10% of faculty at top research universities versus nearly 25% at community colleges.
And men still dominate certain fields.
Especially the sciences at major universities, where teaching loads might be lighter and research support greater. Data shows women are much less likely to be full professors in top science departments. Women tend to be concentrated in the semi-professions, like nursing and education, or fields like languages with heavy teaching loads.
And the pay gap persists in college and university settings, too.
Yes. Salary data showed women's pay increased less than men's between 1970 and 1980, widening the gap. Even today, the material states women at all ranks and in all fields generally earn less than men at the same level.
Plus, women are overrepresented as adjuncts.
Hugely. Over half of the part-time adjunct instructors, who teach a massive proportion of college classes, often for low pay and no benefits, are women. And while there's been progress, men still dominate the top administrative positions in universities, though more women have recently become presidents of major institutions.
And underlying a lot of this for women's advancement is the work-family balance issue.
That burden still falls disproportionately on women, according to the material. Female professors and teachers with kids spend way more time on childcare, elder care, housework than their male colleagues.
This came up in the Lawrence Summers controversy at Harvard.
Right. When he suggested women might be biologically unsuited for the 80-hour weeks sometimes expected in top science careers. The pushback from female scientists highlighted in the material wasn't about biology, but about the impossibility of anyone maintaining such a schedule and having a family life without significant domestic support, usually provided by a partner.
The material even does the math.
Yeah, asking if an 80-hour work week plus basic life needs leaves any reasonable time for family, relaxation, anything else. It questions the rationality of that work expectation itself, for anyone.
So work-family conflict is a major systemic barrier for women in education, just like in other fields.
A huge factor maintaining gender inequality within the educational workplace itself.
Okay, so given all these complex issues, historical baggage, socialization, workplace inequality, it leads some people to ask, maybe single-sex schooling is the answer.
It's a recurring debate, definitely. When you see data suggesting gender gaps in some areas, like science, might be widening for teenagers, some educators start to feel like co-ed schools just aren't working, that they're still male-dominated and male-controlled.
That anecdote about the teacher trying to call on students equally is telling.
Isn't it? Peggy Orenstein's story. The teacher uses a roster for fairness. The boys complain loudly that she's calling on girls more. She proves them wrong with the data, but their perception was that equality felt like a loss because they were used to dominating the attention.
That really reveals how entrenched male privilege can be in the classroom dynamic.
And experiences like that fuel the arguments for single-sex education. Back when colleges were going co-ed in the 70s, some studies emerged suggesting single-sex environments had benefits. Elizabeth Tidball's study on women in Who's Who is often cited.
Arguing women's colleges were better for achievement.
Yes, especially those with lots of female faculty. But the material offers some serious critiques of that study.
Like what?
Flaws like using data from before elite male schools open to women, small sample size, not accounting for why women were in Who's Who connections, and assuming correlation meant causation. The critique basically says Tidball might have just measured the effect of social class, since women attending those colleges were often wealthy and from elite private schools already.
So maybe it was wealth and prior schooling, not the single-sex college itself.
That's the counter-argument. And later research actually found co-ed colleges produce more women graduates in STEM fields. While some studies showed slight gains for men in single-sex colleges, those often disappeared when you controlled for class and high school background.
And there are strong arguments against all-male colleges specifically.
Yeah, figures like David Reisman called them unfortunate, prone to excess. Jenks and Reisman argued they preserve tacit assumptions of male superiority, ultimately harming both men and women by fostering arrogance.
The conclusion drawn is that women's colleges might challenge inequality, while men's colleges reproduce it.
That's the distinction made. Women learn they can do what men do. Men might learn that women cannot. Carol Tavris suggests women's schools might have a place for boosting confidence, but co-education remains the ideal for educating individuals.
And promoting single-sex schools for girls could backfire by reinforcing stereotypes.
The idea that girls can't succeed in co-ed settings and need special protection. The material calls this resigned defeatism, giving up on fixing co-ed schools.
The VMI and Citadel cases really brought this all to a head, didn't they? State military schools fighting tooth and nail against admitting women.
Absolutely. Their core argument was that their adversative method, super harsh, stressful, regimented, only worked for males. They made all these claims about women being too weak, too emotional, unable to handle stress.
Saying women would destroy male bonding.
Yes, introducing sexual tension being a toxic kind of virus. They proposed separate, supposedly superior leadership programs for women elsewhere.
But the Supreme Court didn't buy it.
Saw right through it. Called the alternative a pale shadow. Women were admitted, and the reality, only a small number of men or women are attracted to that system, and male applications actually went up after VMI went co-ed.
So the material argues that most modern single-sex proposals are based on flawed ideas about innate differences.
Often relying on facile, incorrect assessment of biologically based needs, promoting this idea of an unbridgeable chasm. John Dewey, the educator, is quoted being infuriated by this, scoffing at things like female botany and saying there's so much assertion based on so little evidence regarding male and female minds.
Dewey actually saw benefits to coeducation for both sexes.
He did. Argued it made women more self-reliant, less manipulative, and toned up ultra-feminine weaknesses. For men, he thought it taught gentleness and courtesy, channeling their energy constructively. Higginson also saw single-sex schools as a mistake.
Yet the idea keeps coming back, sometimes aimed at helping specific groups like black boys or girls.
But the critique remains. The material mocks descriptions from one single-sex advocacy group about girls needing sofas and beanbags and teachers who don't yell, calling it insulting, stereotypical, and asking what the opposite pedagogy for boys would be. Dangerous. Confrontational.
And the success of some single-sex schools might just be about resources.
That's a key point. They're often private, small, well-funded, with low student-teacher ratios and wealthier students. Those factors likely drive success, not just the separation, form over content. Promoting single-sex public schools is framed as giving up on fixing public education for everyone.
So if separating isn't the main answer, what does progress towards real gender equality in schools look like?
The material points to a few things. Some districts are experimenting with single-sex classes within co-ed schools, often in math or science. And there have been specific efforts, like academies for black boys or girls in urban areas, trying to address achievement gaps.
Like the Detroit all-male academy proposal.
Right, created in response to really serious issues, low GPAs, high suspensions, dropouts for black males. The goal was self-esteem, role models, academic improvement. But these proposals often faced opposition, lawsuits arguing they ignored girls' needs or were discriminatory. Most were withdrawn or shut down.
And the evidence for these single-sex public school innovations is shaky.
Inconsistent and discouraging is how the material puts it. It argues they often treat a class problem, lack of resources, poverty, as if it's a racial or gender problem that separation can fix. Kids thrive with resources and good teachers, regardless of gender mix. The role model argument is important, but maybe economic hope is more effective for struggling communities.
The Young Women's Leadership School in Harlem is mentioned as having some success, though.
Yes, showing somewhat better results for girls than local co-ed schools, founded specifically to give inner-city kids more options. But even it faced legal challenges as discriminatory against boys.
And broader research hasn't shown consistent academic gains from single-sex classrooms in public schools.
The AEW found girls might feel better, but didn't necessarily achieve more in math science. Other research shows mixed results. Maybe some benefit for disadvantaged minority girls in Catholic schools, but not much elsewhere. Maggie Ford from AUW was quoted, "Separating by sex is not the answer."
Kenneth Clark, key figure in Brown v. Board of Ed was against segregating black males, too.
Saw it as stigmatizing, a step backward from integration. And that California pilot program, depressing results, reinforced stereotypes, mostly shut down.
Okay, but one area where policy did clearly advance gender equality in schools is Title IX.
Absolutely. Title IX's 1972 is highlighted as a landmark achievement, especially for athletics. Before Title IX, girls were mostly on the sidelines, cheering for boys' teams that got all the funding.
It mandated equal opportunity and funding.
Yes, prohibiting sex discrimination in public schools, requiring equal sports funding. The football's unique status complicates things. The results were huge. Girls' high school sports participation skyrocketed, college women's involvement grew massively.
And the benefits go beyond sports.
Don Sabo's research, cited, shows female athletes have lower rates of risky behaviors, higher grades, more positive outlooks. Good for them, good for society.
But Title IX faced huge backlash, right? Claims of reverse discrimination.
Oh, yeah. Loud and vociferous criticism, arguing that enforcing it made males the new victims, especially when some men's minor sports teams were cut to achieve funding proportionality.
And attempts were made to weaken the law.
A commission proposed changes that critics, like the NYT editorial cited, said would significantly undermine the equality Title IX stood for. The material critiques this zero-sum thinking, suggesting funds could be reallocated from inflated budgets in big revenue men's sports rather than cutting smaller programs.
The core principle is just fairness.
Equal opportunity for girls and boys. And Title IX's success proves women seize those opportunities. Plus, the material argues having strong, capable women who value their bodies benefits guys too.
Finally, the material mentions states mandating gender equity programs.
Yes, programs aimed at reducing obstacles for both girls and boys. Things like harassment, bullying, rigid stereotypes enforced by peers and sometimes teachers.
Bringing it back to that core harmful assumption.
That males and females are just fundamentally different and can't learn equally well together. The ultimate conclusion presented is that gender inequality in education doesn't just reflect differences, it actively produces them, harming both sexes, impairing their ability to find their voice, develop their minds, and prepare for the future.
Okay, wow. Let's try to pull this all together. You've covered a lot in this deep dive into the gendered classroom. The central idea seems to be that schools are doing way more than just teaching subjects.
Right. From day one right through college, they're acting as these really powerful, often kind of invisible engines of gender socialization. They don't just mirror society's gender norms. They actively construct and reinforce them.
Through the official curriculum, sure, but also through all those hidden messages, the teacher interactions, and maybe most powerfully through peer pressure, the gender police.
Exactly. And we've talked about the real-world impact, that documented drop in girls' self-esteem and ambitions in adolescence, alongside the intense pressure on boys to fit into this really narrow, sometimes damaging box of masculinity. That pressure shapes everything from their emotional lives to their academic choices.
And the material strongly suggests that the differences we see between boys and girls in school are often the result of all this inequality and socialization, not the cause.
Yeah, that's a key takeaway. It's not necessarily innate. It's often produced by the system itself.
Which leads to the point that making schools more equitable, tackling stereotypes, ensuring equal opportunities, stopping harassment doesn't just help one group. It actually makes things better for everyone. It's not that battle of the sexes, zero-sum game.
Right. And it makes you question those seemingly simple fixes, like just separating boys and girls, which might ignore the deeper issues of resources, teaching quality, and those underlying gender biases.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? Reflect back on your own time in school. Can you pinpoint moments, or maybe just a general feeling, where things felt different because you were a boy or a girl? How did those lessons, the spoken and unspoken ones, shape how you acted? What you thought you were good at, or what you thought was possible?
And maybe here's a final thought, something to chew on after this deep dive. If schools really are this powerful in shaping gender, and if the goal is genuine equality that benefits everyone, what needs to change most fundamentally? We can talk about policies and curriculum, but what about those everyday interactions, the subtle expectations? How do we effectively challenge that gender police operating in the hallways and classrooms? What could you, right now, whether you're involved in schools as a student, teacher, parent, or just as an informed citizen, what could you do to push back against those dynamics and help build a learning space that's truly equitable and lets all kids thrive?
That's a big question and a really important one to leave our listeners with. This has been The Deep Dive.